Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, this one should be a pretty interesting one. We are going to be talking about trade and commerce in the British Empire. And we have some very fascinating sources.
Yes, some really great material for this deep dive.
And it's going to cover, sort of the 1800s. And we're going to be talking about some pretty interesting figures.
Oh, definitely. Some names that will be familiar, I'm sure, and some that might not be, but all very important to this story.
Yeah, Cecil Rhodes. We're going to be learning about him.
Key figure.
The East India Company.
Yeah, that's one that I think will really open some eyes. I mean, we're going to be talking about their activities, their impacts.
That's going to be a big one for sure.
It's a long and complex history.
And I think you'll be surprised by some of the things we uncover along the way.
Oh, I guarantee it. There are some real surprises when you dig into the details.
So to really understand how trade functioned within the British Empire, we need to kind of set the scene.
Absolutely. Context is everything. So imagine the 19th century, a time of rapid expansion for the British Empire, fueled by the desire for new markets.
And of course, for resources, valuable resources that could fuel British industries and enhance their wealth and power.
Right. And to illustrate that point, you had individuals like Cecil Rhodes.
Ah, yes, Rhodes. A man driven by a vision of a British Africa, a man who ultimately played a key role in the establishment of Rhodesia as we know it.
At the same time, you have the East India Company.
Yes, the East India Company with their own private armies made up of Indian sepoys consolidating their power in India.
It's remarkable how much economic potential was tied to these activities.
Absolutely, and it helps to explain why these ventures were so attractive to investors.
Well, and the potential for profit was certainly there. I mean, in the late 1600s, the East India Company was paying out a 22% annual dividend.
That's an incredible return on investment. Imagine if your investments today were making more than double their value every 5 years.
It would be phenomenal, right?
It was a level of return that attracted even the most influential figures of the time. Like who? Well, for example, the Duke of Buckingham.
Okay.
A member of the Royal Privy Council, no less, he was heavily invested in the East India Company.
And it just shows you how closely intertwined money and politics really were back then.
Oh, absolutely. It demonstrates just how deeply economic interests were interwoven with political power and imperial ambitions. It's a recurring theme that we see throughout this period.
Now, amidst all this expansion, a revolutionary new economic philosophy takes root: free trade.
Yes. This is where things start to get really interesting.
And the man behind it is none other than Adam Smith.
The father of modern economics, his groundbreaking work, Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, challenged centuries of established economic thought.
What were some of the core ideas he was proposing?
Well, Smith argued that the old ways of thinking, things like mercantilism, where countries tried to hoard wealth through strict control of trade, were actually limiting overall prosperity.
So he was basically saying, let's open things up, let's have competition.
Exactly. He believed that open competition and minimal government intervention in the market would lead to greater wealth for everyone.
This invisible hand guiding individuals towards choices that would ultimately benefit everyone.
A powerful idea that continues to shape economic policy today.
So did Britain just jump on the free trade bandwagon, wholeheartedly embracing Smith's ideas?
Well, it's tempting to think so, but the story is much more complicated. While Smith's ideas definitely influenced British policy, the reality of the empire's trade practices was often a mixed bag. Sometimes those principles of free trade were conveniently ignored when it came to protecting British interests.
Ah, the classic do as I say, not as I do situation.
Exactly.
Can you give us a concrete example of that contradiction in action?
Absolutely. One of the most striking examples is the Irish potato famine, a horrific tragedy that unfolded in the mid-1800s.
Right, the potato blight, millions in Ireland facing starvation.
And you might think that the British government would rush in to help, but Parliament was hesitant to intervene.
Really? Why was that?
Their reluctance stemmed from a deeply held belief in free markets, even in the face of widespread suffering. They feared that providing direct aid would create what economists call a moral hazard.
Moral hazard. What does that even mean in this context?
Essentially, they worried that if people knew they could rely on government handouts, they would become dependent and lose the motivation to help themselves. This, they argued, would distort the natural workings of the market and ultimately harm everyone.
So basically, they were saying it's better to let people starve than to interfere with the free market.
It was a controversial stance, to say the least. Even Sir Robert Peel, who was Prime Minister at the time, faced immense criticism for the limited aid he was able to send to Ireland.
And wasn't his government ultimately brought down by this crisis?
It was.
Yeah.
His government eventually collapsed under the weight of the crisis, and even The Economist, a prominent publication at the time, condemned the government's inaction, questioning whether rigid adherence to free market principles was truly justified in such a dire situation.
So the Irish potato famine really exposed the limitations of blindly applying free trade principles without considering the human cost.
Precisely. And unfortunately, this wasn't an isolated incident. The British Empire's actions often contradicted the very ideals of free trade they claimed to champion.
And a prime example of this is the East India Company's activities in India.
Right. Instead of fostering open competition, as free trade would suggest, the East India Company's goal was to establish a monopoly, using their power to control trade and maximize profits through things like high taxes.
So basically taking advantage of their position of power.
That's one way to put it. The East India Company was granted a monopoly by the Queen,
Wow.
giving them a massive advantage over any potential competitors. They used this power to push aside local rulers like the Mughal emperor, dictating the terms of trade and enriching themselves at the expense of the Indian people.
And this also ties into the Opium Wars in China, right?
Absolutely. The East India Company was deeply involved in the opium trade, despite the devastating social and economic consequences it had on the Chinese population. When the Qing dynasty attempted to ban opium imports, Britain used its military might, including the Royal Navy, to force China to open its markets.
So much for free trade.
It's a clear example of hypocrisy, of imposing free trade on others while fiercely protecting their own interests.
It really highlights the contradictions at the heart of the British Empire's approach to trade.
Yes, eager to reap the benefits of free trade, but not necessarily playing by its rules, especially when those rules conflicted with their own ambitions.
Right, and all of this trade required a way to actually move goods around the globe.
Absolutely, and this is where the infrastructure of empire comes into play.
Ships, railways, canals, the veins and arteries of the British Empire.
A vast and intricate network spanning continents.
Tell us more about it.
Well, the British invested heavily in their transportation network. The Royal Navy played a crucial role, not just in military terms, but also in protecting British merchant ships, ensuring the smooth flow of trade.
Protecting those valuable goods, making sure they reach their destination.
Precisely. And then you have the development of faster and more efficient ships.
Like the clipper ships.
Yes, the clipper ships, known for their speed, were used for transporting valuable goods like tea and spices. And then, of course, comes the rise of steamships.
Which could carry even larger quantities of cargo.
Exactly. Revolutionizing global trade and making it possible to move goods on a scale never seen before.
And what about railways? Weren't they a major part of the British Empire's expansion as well?
Absolutely. Railway imperialism becomes a defining feature of this period.
And it wasn't just limited to Britain itself, right?
No. In self-governing colonies like Canada and Australia, as well as places like India and West Africa, massive amounts of private investment poured into building vast railway networks.
Connecting different corners of the empire.
Exactly. Facilitating the transport of raw materials to ports and the distribution of British manufactured goods throughout the colonies.
So it wasn't just about conquest and control, it was about building the infrastructure to support this massive trade network.
Precisely, a truly global enterprise.
So what exactly was flowing through this vast network? What were the products being exchanged?
It was a truly global network of exchange with goods from all corners of the empire moving through its arteries.
Let's break it down.
Okay, well, from colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, you'd find a steady flow of agricultural products.
So they were like the bread baskets of the empire.
You could say that supplying Britain with cheap foodstuffs like wheat and also raw materials like wool, which fueled the textile industry back in England.
And it makes sense. Vast lands, fertile soil climates, perfect for agriculture.
Ideal for feeding a growing empire.
But what about those more exotic luxury goods? Did the British Empire have those too?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the tropical colonies like South Africa teeming with products like cocoa coffee,
Ground nuts.
sugar palm oil. The scents and flavors alone must have transformed British society.
The tastes of empire, exotic and desirable.
Exactly, and they played a significant role in shaping British culture and consumption habits.
It's making me crave a cup of tea.
And speaking of tea, India was a major source for the British Empire.
Right.
Tea from India became a massive export and quickly became a staple of British life. But it's important to remember that tea wasn't just a commodity. It had profound cultural significance.
Think about all those rituals associated with tea drinking, afternoon tea parties.
They became integral parts of British identity, and they're all made possible by the trade with India.
Ah, yes, the Opium Wars. A stark reminder of how trade can be entangled with exploitation and power.
A dark chapter in this story,
Yeah.
for sure. But shifting gears a bit, we've talked about agriculture, and those specialty crops.
What about mineral resources? Was the British Empire digging up riches too?
Oh, you bet they were. The British Empire was a veritable treasure trove of mineral wealth. For example, tin, a valuable metal used in everything from cans to electronics, was being mined in large quantities in Nigeria. This influx of tin helped fuel Britain's industrial growth, playing a key role in their economic dominance during the 19th century.
And I'm guessing gold and diamonds were also part of the equation.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Gold was being extracted in massive quantities from places like South Africa, Rhodesia, and the Gold Coast. These gold mines were engines of wealth, attracting fortune seekers and fueling economic expansion. And then there were the diamonds from Sierra Leone and South Africa, specifically from the Kimberley diamond mines, which quickly became synonymous with luxury and wealth.
It sounds like the British Empire had a finger in every profitable pie.
They certainly did. They had a knack for finding and exploiting valuable resources wherever they could.
But with all these raw materials flowing into Britain, did the colonies themselves develop their own industries?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the power dynamics at play within the British Empire. The answer is, unfortunately, not really. Remember how Britain was considered the workshop of the world? They had a vested interest in maintaining their manufacturing dominance, and they actively discouraged industrial development in their colonies.
So it was a system designed to benefit Britain first and foremost.
Exactly. Keep the colonies as suppliers of raw materials and consumers of British manufactured goods. A strategy to ensure British economic dominance and keep the colonies dependent.
A pattern that sadly continues to affect many former colonies today.
It's a sobering reminder of how the legacies of empire can have long-lasting consequences, shaping economies and global power dynamics for generations.
So what was the overall impact of all this trade on the colonies themselves? Was it all bad, or were there some benefits as well?
Well, like most things in history, it's a complex story with both positive and negative aspects. On the one hand, British investment did lead to the development of infrastructure in many colonies,
Roads, railways, ports.
things that could potentially benefit everyone. And they brought access to capital, which could be used for development projects.
That does sound positive. But you mentioned it was a mixed bag. What were the downsides to this arrangement?
Well, the downsides were significant and, in many cases, outweighed the benefits. Being tied to the British trade network often meant a loss of national sovereignty for the colonies. They had little control over their own economies and were often burdened with high taxes that benefited Britain more than their own people.
The classic colonial story: extract resources, control the economy, and leave the local population with the short end of the stick.
Unfortunately, that was often the reality. And remember how we talked about the uneven distribution of benefits? Even when infrastructure was developed, it often primarily benefited the wealthy elite or served the needs of the British Empire, rather than addressing the basic needs of the local population.
Like the example we discussed earlier of India having an extensive railway network before having clean water accessible to everyone.
Exactly. A prime example of how development can be skewed to benefit those in power.
And on top of that, this system stifled the growth of local industries.
Yes, colonies were actively discouraged from developing their own manufacturing, leaving them dependent on British imports for finished goods. It created a cycle of dependency that was hard to break free from.
It's clear that trade, especially in the context of empire, is not just about economics. It's about power control and shaping the destinies of nations.
Well said. And there's another twist in this story that I find fascinating, one that reveals how even empires can adapt and evolve when their dominance is challenged.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. What's this twist?
Well, remember those chartered companies we discussed earlier, like the East India Company?
Yeah.
You might assume that after all the controversy and scrutiny surrounding their practices, they would have faded into the annals of history. But that's not what happened.
They made a comeback.
They did.
Yeah.
In the late 1800s, as Britain faced growing competition from other European powers vying for global dominance, they actually turned back to these chartered companies.
Really? It was like Back to the Future for the British Empire.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a fascinating example of how historical patterns can repeat themselves, even when they seem to contradict prevailing ideologies. But we'll have to save that story for part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, cliffhanger. We'll have to wait to hear more about these resurgent chartered companies. I'm already hooked.
I promise it'll be worth the wait.
I'm sure it will.
Welcome back.
All right, so let's dig into this resurgence of chartered companies in the late 1800s.
It's really quite a fascinating chapter, I think, in the story of the British Empire. It reveals how empires adapt and evolve.
Especially when faced with new challenges.
Exactly. They had to find ways to maintain their power.
So after everything we talked about with free trade and, those downsides of companies like the East India Company, you'd think chartered companies would be done for.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does.
But as Britain faced more and more competition from other European powers,
Oh, right in the late 19th century.
yeah, they turned back to these chartered companies
As a tool.
as a way to expand the empire.
So they were like, okay, let's dust off the old playbook.
Yeah, they realized that these companies, with their, mix of private enterprise and state backing,
Yeah.
they were still pretty effective.
So it was a way to project British power and influence.
Exactly, and in a changing world.
But what were some of the specific factors that led to this comeback for chartered companies?
Well, one key factor was that growing economic rivalry between those European powers.
Oh, yeah. Germany, France.
Belgium. Everyone's trying to get a piece of the pie.
It's like a colonial arms race.
Yeah, great analogy. Everyone's scrambling to secure their own colonies, their own resources, and Britain felt that pressure.
They had to keep up.
Exactly. They had to maintain their global standing.
And their economic dominance.
Of course. And in this race, chartered companies, they were valuable assets.
In what way?
Well, they could move more, quickly operate with some autonomy,
Oh, okay.
and importantly, they could use private capital to finance their ventures.
So less burden on the British government.
Exactly a win-win for the government. They got to expand the empire without necessarily having to pay for it all themselves.
I see. So they could maintain a lighter footprint.
Yeah, at least when it came to direct government involvement.
So which companies were the major players in this new era of chartered ventures?
Well, we touched on the North Borneo Trading Company earlier.
Right. They were focused on Borneo,
Yeah, in Southeast Asia, extracting resources, coal, iron, tobacco.
a classic example of, resource extraction.
Yeah, often with little regard for the local people or the environment.
Okay, so similar story, different location. Were there any other notable chartered companies operating elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most powerful and influential companies of this era was the British South Africa Company.
And who founded that one?
None other than Cecil Rhodes.
Wow, talk about full circle.
Yeah, he was a key figure in this resurgence of chartered companies.
So what was their goal in Southern Africa?
Well, armed with a royal charter giving them vast powers. The British South Africa Company was tasked with expanding British influence and control in Southern Africa. They were given a huge amount of territory with the authority to govern, raise armies, and exploit resources. Essentially operate as a quasi-state.
It's like the East India Company, but on an even grander scale.
Yeah, you could say that.
What were their primary motivations? Purely economic, or was there something more to it?
Well, there's no doubt they were motivated by profit.
Yeah.
I mean, Southern Africa was incredibly rich in resources, especially gold and diamonds.
Right, highly sought after.
But their ambitions went beyond just resource extraction. They envisioned creating a vast British dominion stretching from the Cape of Good Hope all the way to Cairo.
Wow, a British dominion spanning the entire length of Africa.
It was a bold vision, a testament to the enduring power of the British Empire.
So a mix of economic interests and imperial ambition.
Yeah, and maybe even a bit of national pride, a sense of romanticism about empire.
It's fascinating how these chartered companies embody the contradictions of the British Empire.
Yeah, pursuing profit, promoting this idea of a civilizing mission.
But did they actually achieve their goals? What was the impact of these companies?
Well, the legacies of these chartered companies are complex and multifaceted.
With both positive and negative consequences, I imagine.
Exactly. And those consequences continue to shape the world we live in today.
Well, let's unpack those legacies and see how they connect to the world we live in today. It's amazing to think about, those chartered companies aiming to create a dominion across the entire length of Africa.
A truly ambitious goal.
It really highlights the scale of the British Empire's ambitions.
Absolutely, a global vision.
But let's bring things closer to home. What do these stories about trade and empire mean for us today?
That's the key question, isn't it? How does this history connect to the world we live in?
Because it's not just ancient history, right?
No, not at all. The echoes of these events, these economic forces, we can feel them all around us. The legacies of colonial trade, the patterns of global commerce, even those geopolitical relationships we see today. They have roots in the systems and events we've been discussing.
So you're saying that we're still living in the shadow of the British Empire?
In many ways, yes. The global economic system, for example, with its emphasis on free trade, interconnectedness, the flow of goods and resources, all of this has deep connections to the patterns established during the colonial era. And many of the challenges faced by former colonies today, poverty, inequality, political instability, those can be traced back to the systems put in place during the British Empire.
It's a bit unsettling to realize how much history shapes our present.
It's not just something we read about in textbooks. It's
Yeah.
woven into the fabric of our lives.
So how do we grapple with this legacy? What can we learn from it?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging the complexity of this history. It's easy to fall into those simplistic narratives of good guys and bad guys, but the reality is much more nuanced.
There are shades of gray.
Exactly. We've seen how the British Empire's impact on trade was a mixed bag. There were positive and negative aspects, and it's essential to recognize both.
Seeing the full picture.
Yes, the British Empire wasn't just about exploitation and oppression. It also brought about some advancements in infrastructure technology, even governance in certain cases.
So what are some specific lessons we can learn? How can we apply these insights to create a more just world?
One crucial lesson is that trade, while often presented as this universally beneficial force, can also be a tool for exploitation and control. We need to be mindful of those power dynamics, making sure that trade truly benefits all parties involved, not just those with the most leverage.
It's not just about free trade, it's about fair trade.
Exactly. We need to move beyond that simplistic notion that free trade automatically leads to a level playing field.
And we need to be aware of that historical baggage that comes with trade.
Absolutely. The legacy of colonialism still influences global trade, sometimes in very subtle ways.
So recognizing those structural inequalities that persist.
And working towards dismantling them. Developing countries often face significant disadvantages in the global market, and addressing those disparities is crucial for creating a fairer and more balanced system.
And what about the role of corporations?
Yes, that's another key point. We've seen how entities like those chartered companies with their blend of private profit and state power could exert enormous influence, often at the expense of local populations.
And today, multinational corporations often wield more power than some nation-states.
It's true. So ensuring accountability and transparency is more important than ever. We need strong mechanisms to regulate their activities and prevent those kinds of exploitation that were all too common during the colonial era.
So learning from the mistakes of the past.
Exactly, and creating a system that prioritizes human well-being and environmental sustainability.
It's not just about remembering the past, it's about using that knowledge to build a better future.
Well said. We need to ensure that trade becomes a force for good, promoting sustainable development and shared prosperity for all.
That's an inspiring thought, and it gives me hope that we can learn from history and build a more just and equitable world. So to our listeners, as you go about your day, consider the products you use, the clothes you wear, the food you eat. Think about the often invisible journeys they've taken to reach you. Remember those legacies of trade, the empires that rose and fell, the stories of both exploitation and resilience.
Powerful stories.
And let that knowledge inspire you to be a more conscious consumer, a more informed citizen, and a more active participant in shaping a just and equitable world.
We all have a role to play.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of trade and commerce in the British Empire.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've learned something new, challenged some assumptions, and maybe even sparked a few conversations. Join us again for another fascinating deep dive into the past, present, and future. Until then, happy exploring,